mission successful. State remaining.
Good afternoon and welcome to the final day of this year's Army Summit. We've had some really good discussions so far and there's still some more to come. Yesterday, we talked about the future of joint operations and how the armed forces collectively can adapt to an increasingly unpredictable environment, both at home and abroad. Today, our discussions will look at what uncertainty and resilience means in the context of whole-of-government approaches. To address some of these topics, we're fortunate enough to have with us today General Ben Hodges from the Center for European Policy and Analysis, former US Commanding General in Europe, as well as Minister of Foreign Affairs Ine Eriksen Søreide. Ben is both a military practitioner and a scholar with a unique insight into how civil and military authorities can work together to counter new generation warfare. Ben has not wasted much of his time during this pandemic, taking every opportunity on and off screen to caution against malicious influence operations at a time when the whole world is preoccupied with responding to the pandemic. Ben, over to you.
Aisha, thank you very much. And to General Lervik, thank you for the privilege of speaking with your officers and soldiers. And I would like to commend you for taking the effort to bring your leaders together, to make sure that they understand how you think about things and that they keep their focus on the importance of deterrence and doing their mission despite the pandemic and all the other challenges around you. So I thank you for the privilege to be a part of this. I knew a couple of your predecessors. Rune Jakobsen was the first Norwegian Army chief that I had the chance to meet and get to know when I was the commander of NATO's Allied Land Command. And I remember Rune told me, he said, Ben, every time I walk into any NATO headquarters, the map of Norway is always cut off right at the very top. So the top 15% of Norway is always missing on the map. And so that stuck in my head, and I made sure that every day after that any map I ever put up included that top few percentage of Norway. Now, after that, with Odin Johannesson, we were talking one day. In fact, we were speaking to some cadets at the military academy. And I said, Odin, what is the biggest threat? What's the biggest threat that Norway faces? And he immediately pointed right to that exact same part of Norway. That his concern was that if the Russians ever, in a coup de main, attempted to seize this northern part of Norway, that would be significant because it would change all the calculations for how does NATO protect and observe the so-called GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK. And so both of those Army commanders really opened my eyes to the geography of Norway. Now, I'm not going to spend a few minutes telling you how important the Arctic is. I'm from Florida. And you guys, you already appreciate the important role you have. I always thought it was humorous when the Chinese said, hey, we are a near Arctic state. And I thought, well, being from Florida, we have so many Canadians that migrate to Florida every year that Florida is sort of a near Arctic state also. But I won't try to talk about Arctic issues except to say that you anchor NATO's northern flank. It's so important that we have strength all the way from the northern tip of the alliance to the southeastern tip, Turkey, and then the Black Sea. Number one, because these are allies that have to be protected, but also to give the alliance some flexibility, some options for what we call horizontal escalation. If the Kremlin were to attempt to do something, perhaps say in Lithuania around the Suwalki corridor or in Romania, having real capability on the northern flank is important, just like it is on the southern flank. Now, our challenge in the Baltic Sea is where the alliance focused in 2016, correctly, I think, and we've taken huge steps. And of course, Norwegian soldiers are there as part of the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Lithuania under German leadership. The rapid response of the alliance to deploy enhanced forward presence in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland was significant. And then all the other things that have gone on since then. But what was neglected was the Black Sea region. And I really think that the Black Sea is, in fact, the most important strategic area for the Kremlin. The Black Sea is what Russia uses, particularly with their illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula and the base they have there. That's what gives them the launching pad for everything that they do in Syria and in Libya. If you did not have Kremlin support for the Assad regime, you would not have 3 or 4 million refugees moving across Europe and creating and challenging the cohesion of Europe. This is what General Breedlove calls the weaponization of refugees. That was not an accident. This was intended outcome by the Kremlin. That's only possible because of their control of Crimea and their attempt to dominate in the Black Sea region. Now, I'm going to go just a couple of more minutes because I really would like to address questions from all of you, but there are several topics that I'd like to kind of lay out to let you know where I'm happy to go. I do believe that we're going to be in a kinetic conflict with China in the next 5 years. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong on that, but I think it's the case. And the United States does not have the capacity to deal with China, to deter Russia, to contain Iran, to try and protect all the global commons. Our great Navy is stretched. Even with the world's largest defense budget in history, we do not have the capacity to do everything that needs to be done. And so we've got to figure out how do we make sure that Europe remains safe and secure, but there's not going to be a large American footprint. There's going to be commitment, and I think you can challenge me on this here in a few minutes, Aisha, or maybe somebody in the audience. But we are in need of allies now more than ever, probably in the last 80 years. We need allies now. We need a strong European pillar, not a European pillow. And that's why there's so much emphasis on this 2%, on burden sharing. Norway, of course, does well. You are one of the most modernized forces. You're famous for the total defense concept, the quality of people, young men and women that join the forces. I've seen Norwegians all over Europe. I had the chance to visit some of the border outposts with General Jakobsen back a few years ago. It was amazing. And to see how much responsibility is put on young people. I love that. But it's also difficult to accept that a nation like Norway still has not been able to reach the agreed upon 2% obligation of investment in your own defense, and especially considering how exposed Norway is and how important air and maritime forces are, as well as land forces. It's a little bit hard to understand. And so I think this is something that Norwegians are going to have to address. Clearly, the top priority has to be on readiness. The second priority, readiness. The third priority, readiness. Making sure that the equipment you have is modernized and it works, that formations are trained and fully manned. After that, I think it's time for a little bit more innovative approach to what 2% means. What the alliance needs is the ability to move quickly, to move fast. And so investment in transportation perhaps should count towards 2%. Cyber protection of transportation networks, and certainly integrated air and missile defense. If the Russians and do something in the Suwalki corridor, for example, or in the Arctic region, then for sure, in addition to cyber, they're going to launch missiles. And I think we have to be able to protect our people against that. Finally, for land forces, equipment is way too heavy. An Abrams tank with everything on it, fully loaded, including the active armored protection system, you're talking about 80 to 85 tons. And then if you put that on the back of a heavy equipment transport, now you're talking about 100 tons. There are not many bridges in Europe, particularly in the most challenged areas of Europe, that can sustain that kind of weight. So I think the idea of robotics, or at least turrets that don't require crews, so you can take off 20 or 30 tons of steel, I think that's going to be part of our future. Last point I'd make, and I look forward to, if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. You know, last night we had a presidential debate in the United States. I got up for it at about 3 o'clock this morning to watch it. There was a couple of times I wished I had not, but nonetheless, it's important to understand what's going on. And I can imagine all my friends and allies in Norway and the rest of Europe are puzzled as well. And I'd be happy to address any of that. So Aisha, thanks. General Larvik, thanks. And back to you.
Thank you, Ben. I think in 5 minutes you managed to jump across all regions and all topics. And I think I woke up for the presidential debate, and I wish I hadn't. That was very, very unsettling. But you talk about the probability of a kinetic conflict with China. And there is a question here that addresses that. A real war with China. Please elaborate. Is our democratic way of life in jeopardy?
So I don't envision a scenario where you've got tens of thousands of ground troops involved on the Asian continent, or with American U.S. Army or Marines or doing landings and that sort of thing. What I see as more plausible is something having to do with these islands in the South China Sea, or when the U.S. Navy and allies challenge the Chinese and go through the Taiwan Straits. It's this kind of a scenario where the Chinese have been unprofessional. They've come out, almost rammed U.S. Navy ships. Chinese aircraft, much the way the Russians have been unprofessional in the air. But it's the language that comes out of Beijing now. I think the Chinese saw that the West really did not do anything about Hong Kong. I mean, not even the UK really did anything about Hong Kong. And you just hear a much more martial sounding language coming out of Beijing about Taiwan. And then when they look at the West, they see that the United States is distracted with our own elections. The cohesion of the alliance is challenged. That's why I think there's an increase. I think the Marines, their approach to be able to support the Navy from small islands makes a lot of sense. The role of the Army, of course, we are in South Korea, tens of thousands of U.S. Army that are there. That's important, as well as the U.S. Army in Japan and the U.S. Army in Hawaii. So the Army has a role there.
But what can we do to mitigate such a conflict? Clearly, war is not in our interest. So what are, in your opinion, the steps we can take as an alliance to mitigate?
Well, the absolute number one priority for that is cohesion, where in NATO and with allies in the Pacific, that there is not a doubt about American commitment and the willingness to do what it takes. That's number one. Number two is, and I'm sure this is what the Norwegian Army leadership is focused on, is on readiness, on being prepared to do your job. That's what deterrence is all about. Deterrence is in the mind of the potential attacker, whether it's the Kremlin or the Chinese Communist Party. And if they look across and they see that you've got modernized forces, you can move quickly, you're alert, well-trained, that is the best way to make sure this never happens. And so the United States, of course, everybody knows the strategic focus is beginning to shift more and more to the Pacific, but a stable, secure Europe is just as important for us. So that's why I think people should be confident in American commitment. In Europe, it's not as much stuff.
Which actually, as a follow-up to what you just said about the shifting U.S. focus over to the Pacific, how will the scale back of U.S. forces in Europe impact the long-term U.S.-Europe relations? You yourself, right now, you're sitting in Germany. How do you see the long-term effects of the scale back?
Well, first of all, the announcement by the White House back in July, when Secretary Esper stood up there and laid out the plan or the concept, if you will, I thought this was a terrible mistake. From a strategic standpoint, it's a terrible mistake. The Army is so small in Europe, 30,000. I mean, we're talking about half of a professional football stadium. So that's how many U.S. Army, and most of them are enablers, logistics, intelligence, communications, headquarters, one battalion of Patriot for all of Europe. That's it. There's one combat unit, if you will, the maneuver unit, the striker regiment, but that's it. So it's not much there. And so to reduce that by almost a third, plus what they're talking about with moving the Air Force, some really bad decisions that will not punish Germany, which is what the president intended. We hurt ourselves because Germany allows us to operate out of Germany for so many things that we do in Africa, as well as Europe and in the Middle East. And then the way that it was done without any consultation, without any strategic analysis, I think this causes people to worry about the cohesion and American commitment. That's why I was concerned. I will say this. I am willing to bet that what actually ends up happening will look nothing like what was presented back in July. I mean, just the process, it takes months and months and months of planning, and none of that happened yet. So they're having to do that after the fact. And then it will take years to execute. And the Congress has already indicated that the military Department of Defense cannot use any money from the 2021 budget to do any of this. So I think that's important to keep in mind. In our Constitution, the Congress also has a very important role to play in these kind of things. And so, don't get me wrong. People in the Pentagon are not going to be dragging their feet. They're not going to say, "Well, let's wait and see what happens in November." They're too professional. People will do their job. The fact is, it takes a long time.
You've been very vocal from the outset of the pandemic about the danger of an increasingly belligerent Russia exploiting the COVID-19 crisis to expand its influence in neighboring countries. What measures do you think NATO countries, especially Norway, should take to prepare for increased Russian pressure?
Well, look, Norway for centuries. I mean, you've had to deal with a Russian neighbor. So Norway has somehow figured it out to be a no fooling around, tough, prepared, ready to contribute to deterrence. But at the same time, you've had to figure out how to deal with oil and gas exploration, fishing industry, all of the different things that neighboring nations have to do. So you've figured out how to do that. I personally, I have zero confidence in anything that they ever say. I think that they only respect strength. Now, if the alliance is strong, and if we're sticking together, then you can actually have conversations. You can maintain a dialogue, and I do think maintaining the dialogue is important, but it has to be from a position of strength. So I'm worried that when I hear so many leaders that say, well, the COVID, so the assumption was with COVID, therefore defense spending is going to go down. Well, none of the threats have changed. I mean, the Chinese are building ships at the rate that the United States was building ships back in 1944. I mean, 3 shifts, 24/7. The COVID-19 has not stopped them from anything that they're doing. The Russians just conducted Kavkaz 2020, which is their big annual exercise. This year it was in the Southern Military District. I don't think I'd be willing to bet that Norwegian intelligence has not seen any drop-off in activity of development of new basing in the Arctic region. So they're not changing anything. And if you think about the range of capabilities that they're willing to use from disinformation all the way up to nuclear weapons, I haven't seen any change in anything that they're doing. In fact, an increase in what they're doing in support for General Haftar in Libya.
Well, there's no doubt, as you said, that the threat remains constant, but at the same time, this new enemy in the form of a virus is on headlines everywhere. So I think people can relate more to that. They're more afraid of that as opposed to these security threats that somehow feel a bit distant from their realities, especially as countries go into lockdown and we have health infrastructures collapsing in the very start of the pandemic. So yeah, but you're absolutely right. Threats remain the same.
Aisha, let me you raise a very important point. If our elected civilian leaders are not willing to explain to their population what the threats are, then most people would understandably say, why do I need to, I mean, what the hell does 2% mean when there's no threat? You know, obviously, you know, the COVID is the big threat. Why aren't we putting all our money on that? And that's where I think it's got to, and it can't be uniformed officials. It's got to be civilian leaders that explain to civilian populations, here's the priority. And it is the responsibility of the government. And look, I live in Frankfurt, Germany. It's a great city. And I would imagine that probably 90% of the people that live within 1 kilometer of where I live, you know, are not impressed at all with 2%. Like, come on, Russia, I mean, what's the threat? Because civilian leadership is not willing to explain it. And I think that's the challenge for defense ministers and chiefs of army and chiefs of defense staff is if the civilian leadership is not willing to explain it. And now, again, Norway, I think, has set is a good model to follow on the idea of total defense. They're doing something to prevent the spread of COVID and to help deal with the consequences of COVID is not automatically exclusive of national defense. I mean, when you're talking about healthcare, health systems, people who are healthy, transportation, intelligence sharing, information sharing, the Army always has the best in all those categories. So these are things that actually do help contribute. And I think the mobility, for example, is a place where you know, being able to cross borders, being able to move stuff during the time of lockdown, nobody can do that better than the military. So I don't think COVID and defense spending are exclusive.
No, they're definitely not mutually exclusive. And I think we've tried our very best at this year's Army Summit to show why defense spending matters for our national security. I have so many questions coming in. Russia and China has a number of mutual or coinciding interests. How can Europe and the US use its mutual interest to keep this at bay?
So that's always been the nightmare scenario for decades. You know, even back when I was a lieutenant 100 years ago in northern Germany, you know, the idea that the Chinese and the Soviet Union would somehow coordinate an effort that could overwhelm our ability to respond to all the different things. I think those two have more traditional historical differences than they have shared interests, but I would not be surprised if one took advantage of the other's efforts to do something. That if this conflict in the Pacific or the South China Sea did break out, that the Kremlin might say, okay, the U.S. is fixed over here. Now's the chance to challenge the cohesion of the alliance over here, and vice versa. So, and if you think about Europe, you know, China, the Chinese Communist Party and the Kremlin are going about it in two different ways. The Kremlin, of course, wants spheres of influence in the traditional sense, and it uses all the tools. The Chinese are using investment with the Belt and Road Initiative to create dependencies, and then they end up controlling potentially lots of important parts of the transportation infrastructure, which becomes a vulnerability for all of us. And for sure, if we, the West, cannot come up with a better solution to the 5G network, then you know countries are going to buy that. This is how can the West, Europe, and the United States and Canada not come up with something that's more competitive than
So I want to come back. To what we barely mentioned during the introduction about the cooperation between civilian and military authorities. And there's a question here about how can the European governments work together to enable infrastructure supporting defense purposes across borders? Is this a NATO or EU job?
So interestingly, you may be aware that the European Union recently, I think about a year and a half ago, did a gap analysis of infrastructure. And they overlaid NATO requirements with EU commercial requirements. And it turns out that about 94% of what NATO needs matches about everything that is needed for commercial development. So the development of infrastructure, highways, bridges, rail, airports, seaports. So actually, this should be a no-brainer, that investment that helps business development also helps with military mobility requirements. So I think that the alliance should seriously consider investment in infrastructure that has dual-use military capability. That should count towards 2%. We're doing a workshop at SEPA, military mobility, with 5 different scenarios. One scenario involves moving equipment from Norway into Estonia. And so we've got cyber experts, rail experts, shipping experts, wheeled and tracked vehicle experts, all a part of these workshops that are looking at the challenges. And I think what we're going to find is that everything that needs to be fixed to improve military mobility would also improve commercial development. Again, it seems like a win-win to me.
Yeah, so one can't do without the other. That's, yeah, very intuitive. So yesterday, I'm pretty sure you didn't follow the discussion yesterday unless you know Norwegian, but I'll fill you in. We had a panel discussion with the 3 heads of the Norwegian Army, Navy, and Air Force. But this is the Army Summit after all, and you yourself have Army background. So what's the importance of Army specifically in the current global threat environment, and what capabilities can Army bring in the current climate of uncertainty? And I think that would be the last question for you, Ben, today.
Okay, well, my Norwegian is a little rusty, so thanks for filling me in on that. So I always thought of the Air Force and Navy as really good guys, but they're Army helpers basically. You have the Army, and then you have the Army helpers.
I'm sure General Lars is really smiling at the screen right now.
Okay, look, nobody loves the Navy and the Air Force more than an infantry soldier because of what they represent. Incredible combat power, transportation, enabling, intelligence, all the different stuff. The reason those were developed was because we needed it. And certainly the quality of Norwegian Air Forces and Naval Forces are legendary throughout the alliance, as is the quality of the young men and women in the Norwegian Army. But at the end of the day, it takes a person to protect populations. It takes a person to protect key infrastructure. I have a dear friend. We were 3 stars together. He was a fleet admiral, and I was an Army lieutenant general. And this is after about 12, 13 years in Afghanistan. And he said, "Hey, Ben, sorry, man, your time is up. The Army's been getting all the money for the last 15 years. Now the Congress is going to start shifting money to the Navy and Air Force. It's our time." And I said, "Well, we'll see." He said, "No, look at the map." And he was pointing to a giant map on the wall. And of course, he said, look at all that blue. There's just a little bit of green and brown. Look at all that blue. And so I got real close to the map. I said, "Tom, you know what? You're right. But nobody lives there. Everybody lives on the map where it's green and brown." So you're always going to need soldiers, and nations have to figure out the right balance to protect their own population, to protect their key infrastructure, and then to be able to deter the threats that are out there.
Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us today. I am expecting you to do your share to keep this alliance alive and kicking, and I'm sure that we would do the same from our side here in Norway. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for letting me be a part of it, and congratulations to General Lervik on becoming the Army Chief. And you've got Kate Hansen-Bunt there. She's equal to an armored division. So I think that you've got enough power with Kate.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, it is my great pleasure to introduce Norway's first female foreign minister and one of our best and brightest defense and foreign policy practitioners. Ine is no stranger to the Army Summit and definitely not to the armed forces. As a former Minister of Defense, Ine is very well versed in all aspects of the defense debate. Rumor has it that she's dearly missed by her former colleagues and comrades for her enormous capacity and dedication to the armed forces. In her current role as the foreign minister, she's at the center of defining Norway's diplomatic ambitions and strategic impact globally. Ine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aisha. And I would like, first of all, to say generals, admirals, distinguished listeners, viewers, dear friends. As chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Parliament, and later as defense minister, this was really one of the highlights of a defense minister's calendar every year, to participate at the Army Summit. And I have to say, I'm really, really happy that you invited me back as foreign minister, and with a topic that I think is a very good one chosen by the Army Summit. I've also had the opportunity to listen in to parts of the Army Summit, and I got the pleasure also, of course, to listen to the engaged and I would say insightful speech by my good friend and also my former defense minister colleague, James Mattis, on Monday. And I think, to be honest, that he gave a lot of good points to follow up, not only for me, but also for other speakers. I've been listening also to General Lervik. I've been listening to Ben Hodges and the defense minister, of course. And I would just like to say one thing to Hodges, to correct a piece of information that he gave in his very, very good intervention. He said that many of the maps let 15% of Norway out when you look at the maps in NATO. The reality, however, is that when I became chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, the first maps I saw in NATO, they were cut off around Stavanger. And for all the Norwegian viewers and listeners, you would know that that's quite far south. In NATO context, it was far north. The COVID-19 pandemic has really caused disruption on a global scale to health systems, to our economies, to our daily lives, and to our short-term plans for everything, spanning from travel and political meetings to conferences such as this. The boxer Mike Tyson famously said once, "Everybody has a plan until he gets punched in the mouth." And these days, it's maybe more correct to say that everybody has a plan until you get a running nose. Before this year's Army Summit, I was kind of interested in knowing what kind of angle the Army Summit would take. And interestingly enough, the Army Summit took the angle of not inviting us to contemplate the phase before this punch, but rather to look past it. In today's terms, I would say look past the pandemic. I think we're right to do so, because it remains to be seen what the long-term effects of COVID-19 geopolitically will be. It's not a given that the world of tomorrow will look drastically different than the world would have done without the pandemic. Professor Joseph Nye taught us a lot about this when he reminded us that the Spanish flu in 1918 to 1919 killed more people than World War I. Yet it was the war, not the flu, that changed the world. The security environment was highly complex and evolving even before the pandemic, often with headlines that drew attention away from traditional land power. New complex security challenges are becoming more prevalent. Cyber threats, hybrid warfare, disinformation campaigns, they require some new capabilities. Contours of a protracted, deep strategic rivalry between the US and China draw resources eastward and seems to put more emphasis on naval power. But it would be completely wrong to think that the days of a strong and relevant land power are behind us. Land power will remain a cornerstone of defense and security policy also in the future. It constitutes the spine of Norwegian contributions in international peace and security efforts, and has done so since World War II. From the independent Norway Brigade Group in Germany via Lebanon to present-day engagements in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in the NATO-enhanced forward presence in Lithuania. And land power has also constituted the core of our contributions to the UN over several years. But a strong land power is not least important in our relations with Russia. And balancing deterrence and reassurance towards Russia is a mainstay of Norwegian foreign policy. We have ramped up allied training in Norway, and staying firmly in the driver's seat requires a solid national defense. We started the necessary and also significant turnaround of defense spending from the moment we took office in 2013. From then until today, we have increased Norway's defense spending by about 30%. We see that it gives operational effects, and of course, I'm very tempted to elaborate on that, but I won't do that because I know that the Minister of Defense did it already on Monday. But we have also increased our investments significantly. We are now around 30% parts of investments, which is way above the 20% NATO target. And I can assure General Hodges that we are also very, very close to the 2% target as it is. So we are strengthening our defense. Yet defense is only one of many components of a robust security policy, and even though it is a vital component. We're also ramping up our broader foreign policy and security policy apparatus in order to maintain Norway's space for maneuver. And I will touch on 3 areas today that I do think warrant special attention. First, maintaining a rules-based global order is essential. No defense budget can buy us security and prosperity if the fundamentals of the multilateral system break down. There are reasons for concern regarding the security architecture in Europe in the light of the development in recent years concerning the CFE, the INF, and the Open Skies Treaty. Preserving, strengthening, and reforming the multilateral system is a main foreign policy interest for Norway. Binding international cooperation has always been vital to our security, to our economy. I always use NATO as an example. NATO can be used as an example for many things, I can tell you. In NATO, we commit beyond our own, often narrow, self-interest. We are willing to send our women and men in uniform into harm's way to protect others. That is the ultimate commitment. When we serve as a member of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years, we will do so not only in pursuit of peace and security, effective resolutions of the various conflicts and situations on the agenda, but also with a firm eye on overarching interest of maintaining a strong and effective UN. And the best recipe for safeguarding and strengthening the multilateral system is relevance and reform. At the same time, we will continue to take responsibility through our own actions across the security policy spectrum. We're increasing our defense budget, we are contributing to all of NATO's core tasks, and we play a role in disarmament with our international leadership on disarmament, nuclear disarmament verification. Rivalry and weakened multilateral cooperation has historically been a precursor for protectionism and conflict. We have to keep this from defining our time. Secondly, reform is also required in light of new threats, including new missile technology, cyber, and hybrid. The latter constitutes some particular challenges since adversaries can employ them very quickly to considerable effect, and they can be difficult to attribute. The basic idea is, of course, to create as much uncertainty as possible into decision-making processes. For instance, whether a situation is above or below an Article 5 situation. Hybrid threats are not new. They have existed in some shape or form always. But they are now also being employed by the strong part in the situation. Historically, it has been a weapon of the inferior military part. The use of hybrid means challenges our space for maneuver as it leaves less time for consultation and response among our allies. Our response must be more effective decision-making. Third, the strategic rivalry between China and the US will shape international politics for years to come. It reflects political and strategic fundamentals. It has bipartisan support in the US, and it is not a short-term blip. While there is much attention being paid to the risk of conflict in the Asia-Pacific, for Norway, the most immediate consequences of this rivalry is felt domestically and in the civilian space. It plays out in the areas of trade, including the vulnerable value chains that Norwegian companies are affected by. It plays out in foreign investment, in research, in technology, in critical infrastructure. And these trends are reinforced by the global pandemic. But Norway is not in a situation where we are choosing sides in the domain of security policy. We made that choice in 1949. At the same time, it is important to safeguard all political aspects that contribute to our prosperity, our stability, and political room for maneuver. An important task is to actually differentiate between genuine security concerns and those who are not genuine security concerns, and to promote cooperation over conflict wherever we can. So confronted with these challenges, it is more important than ever to maintain a good situational awareness, conduct independent analysis, and root our policymaking in the long-standing fundamentals of Norwegian security policy. Also, our policy choices amount to little if we don't have the capabilities to carry them out. And of course, the changing security situation is a reminder that a capable and credible national defense is essential not only to security and stability, but also to conducting sovereign and predictable foreign policy. We need to enhance the political dialogue in NATO in order to deny others the opportunity to drive a wedge between allies. Political cooperation can complement strengthening of the collective defense and deterrence of the alliance that we have been doing since 2014. Political will to come to the aid of all allies make military capability credible. But the opposite is also true. Military capability creates political maneuvering space. And we need to continue pragmatic cooperation between countries that also differ from us, but that share important values. Dear friends, I've tried to stay as true as possible to the task of looking past the pandemic. But I would like to conclude by drawing one obvious parallel between pandemic response and more traditional security challenges. The first duty of any government is protecting its citizens. But a pandemic, like many other threats, does not respect borders. No one is safe until everyone is safe. Isolationism may be very tempting, but it's maybe the least good idea of all when the threat itself cannot be isolated or confined. We are stronger together. No country is in a position to effectively and successfully take control over all aspects of a pandemic response and control alone. To do research, to develop and to produce a vaccine, for instance, in order to safeguard your own population well enough or quickly enough is not something one country can do alone. And again, I revert to using NATO as an example, this time to challenge the false dichotomy between international cooperation and national sovereignty. If sovereignty is the power to influence one's own course, this is surely weakened without international cooperation and alliances. For Norway's part, our space for maneuver in foreign and security policy has always been determined by our ability and our willingness to shape and join alliances. As Jim Mattis said very directly on Monday, I don't know how to defend the US without our allies. International cooperation is both an exercise of sovereignty in practice, as well as strengthening of our sovereign control. Even when, or actually precisely because, we commit ourselves beyond our own narrow self-interest. So in the broader security policy, as well as faced with the pandemic, I think the following stays true. Alone is not an advantage. Solitude is not sovereignty. Dear friends, I'd like to wrap up where I started with Mike Tyson. It's maybe not the most, it's maybe not the most thinkable link, but still. Because like Mike Tyson, we will have our plans disrupted by plenty more punches thrown our way over the coming years. But we plan to stay in the best possible shape and go as many rounds as needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ine. That was, you raised some really, really important points. You touched upon foreign policy objectives, defense policy, and as a die-hard fan of Muhammad Ali, I loved your boxing analogy.
Very good.
So let me begin by asking, how will Norway use its seat on the Security Council? Will you float like a butterfly and sting like a bee?
Well, since you're using the boxing analogies, I think, it's really great that you can do that. Well, when we enter into the council on 1st of January, we all know that we are in for, I would say, a daunting task, because this is really difficult, and that dynamics in the Security Council is not easy, even though most of the discussions on a daily basis go without anyone using their veto or kind of making things difficult. But what we have tried to do as a small country is to use this opportunity not only to strengthen the UN system, but also to play a role where we have a role to play and where we have some advantages. So we have pointed to 4 priorities when we address the country situations. And one of them is, of course, peace diplomacy. And the reason I mention that is because we have over 30 years of, I would say, extensive peace diplomacy, and we have an experience that the Council needs, but we also have a network and a way of working that makes it possible for a small country to at least try to make a difference, and we can maneuver differently than bigger countries, so we can sting like a bee. Hopefully.
Well, it's interesting that you choose to highlight peace diplomacy. One of the questions here is, peace and reconciliation remains a key diplomatic priority for Norway. Norwegian diplomats have undoubtedly played a significant role in facilitating the ongoing peace process in Afghanistan. How do you see this process unfolding, and what are the potential loopholes to achieving the desired outcome? This may sound like a question that's not relevant to the Army Summit, but considering all the soldiers that have been deployed to Afghanistan, the loss of life within the allies, but also in Afghanistan on the civilian side, this is a highly relevant question. So what are the loopholes, and what is Norway doing to secure the deal?
Yeah, well, we're not formally a part of any negotiations, but we're part of an informal group of countries who are there to assist if the parties wants to. And for us, as you know, that has always been a prerequisite for getting engaged, that we only do it on the request of the parties. We don't have our own role, but we are there when they think we can contribute something. So we are ready to do so, and we have been talking consistently about the need for an inclusive process, and I think that's one of the most challenging tasks right now, in addition to the need for reduction of violence and all of the things that needs to come in place. But when I speak to the parties, and I speak to both parties, and just recently also to the Taliban, I always stress the importance of inclusion, not only as a matter of including different groups and ethnic groups in society, but also as a matter of including women, because this is an essential part of how we are thinking. Having said that, we know that there will be some challenges. I mean, it's already been very challenging to get to the point where they are right now. But I've commended the parties on actually taking a lot of they've made sacrifices on both sides to get where they are right now. And I think that needs to be highlighted as a better solution than them not having conversations at all. To actually come to this point is extremely important. But we also need to have very clear expectations to both parties as to what this peace agreement eventually will result in. To not kind of roll back on the achievements that, after all, have been made since 2001. I mean, this is really important. More kids, and especially more girls, are in school. We see that there are developments, although slow, on basic human rights. But to roll that back would be a devastating blow, I think.
So you're hopeful?
As I said when the negotiations started, I'm cautiously optimistic. Yeah.
So you also talked about, I thought it was really nice what you said about that being alone does not mean sovereignty, and that solitude is not something that we should be aiming for. But we are witnessing a divisive and bitterly contested U.S. election, evidenced by last night's debate. I'm sure if you didn't see it, you probably got some. I did. Oh, yeah. In Europe, we are confronted with similar issues. You have Brexit, the rise of the far right, and a deep, growing mistrust in multilateral institutions. Where does Norway stand on these issues, and what role does Norway have to play? Will you step up to the occasion?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that we can. At least that's our clear intention, because we are, in this regard, friends of the system. And that can sound a little strange. But at the same time, together with like-minded countries, and those who are not necessarily like-minded with us in all other aspects, we are trying to work to uphold and to strengthen multilateral institutions.
Would you consider U.S. as a like-minded country in this context?
Well, in many aspects, yes, believe it or not. Given the harsh debates and also much of the rhetoric, you could think it differently. But it is no doubt that when it comes to reform of the system, the U.S. has a lot of good points as to the need for reform, to update an organization or a system to today's challenges. What we often disagree on is how to do it. We do not believe in dismantling a system in order to build it up again. We believe in reform from within. So that's a different approach. That's also why we have criticized the way the US have been working on, for instance, the JCPOA. We have been criticizing how they have been working on the WTO. And also, of course, on withdrawing from the Paris agreements and so forth. But we still find a lot of common ground on the issues. We just have different ways of working with them. And we see increasingly that many countries agree with the approach that we are making.
This is an interesting question and very topical. It is a popular saying to say, look at what the U.S. is doing, not what they are saying. I think it goes back to what both the generals, Jim Mattis and Hodges, said. Does words not matter anymore? As a diplomat, I mean, words is one of your primary tools.
Absolutely, and it most certainly matters. But still, I do think that it's important to look a little bit, I would say, beneath the Twitter storm, as I've said a couple of times, and look at what the U.S. is actually doing. Because contrary to what a lot of people think, the U.S. engagement in Europe is actually stronger now than it has been for a long, long time. That has been a desired outcome for Europe, because we have urged the U.S. to be more engaged in European security. And the fact that the presence is stronger, the investments are I would say, not only are they more in numbers, but also they are more strategic. All of that is a good and welcome development. And the exercise, the training, the fact that the U.S. deployed such a big force to the tried juncture in 2018 is a very good sign of that. And also the work that has been done lately with flights and also naval operations. But of course, words matter. So it is, and that's also why I pointed to in my intervention that we are, in a way, not stronger as a military alliance than our political cohesion.
Exactly.
And that's the point where I want to stress that NATO also needs to focus equally much on the political cohesion, our political unity, as we have been, rightly so, doing with the ramp up of our military capabilities since 2014.
So this question, you said we are over-delivering on defense investments, NATO's 20% guideline. Is this just not creating an unsustainable defense structure?
I don't think so, because, and I will not go into all the details from past history, but one of the main priorities when we issued our current long-term plan, which will now be replaced by a new one shortly, was to make sure that we had a balance in this. So we didn't employ more capabilities than we could actually run on an annual basis, and to make sure that it was enough funding set aside for exercise, for training, not least to maintenance, which is a huge issue. So we also made an arrangement to make sure that the annual increase in costs were taken care of in each budget, so that you wouldn't lose consumer power year by year. That was extremely important, because that adds to the balance. And we do this in a very, a long-term perspective.
Yeah.
So we had it's a 4-year long-term plan, but we had a 20-year planning perspective to make sure that when the investments were at its height of payments, that not everything came exactly at once. So this is part of long-term planning.
This is a question I personally have an issue with, but I'm still going to ask it. We have locked 1% to foreign aid. Why is it so hard to lock 2% to defense?
Oh, well, I think the good answer to that is that we are, as I said, very, very close to the 2% target right now. And that has been a part of a systematic prioritization from the government side. And it is also for us very heartening to see that this actually gathers a lot of political support in Parliament. Only 1 or 2 parties do not abide by the 2% target.
You say you're close, but you're not there.
But
and there's a difference between being at 2% and not being at 2%.
Absolutely. But I think that, the budget will be presented next week, so I think we'll see more of it there. But I think that where we came from when we got into government in 2013 was below 1.5. And the increases that we've done with about 30% of the budget is actually quite a heavy lifting, and it has been alongside infrastructure and health the main priority for the government since 2013. So the sums are large, I would say.
I think this question is relevant to what General Ben also talked about with regards to competing priorities. Is it difficult for a cabinet to prioritize defense in a situation like we are in now? I think it refers to COVID-19, short-term rather than long-term perspectives.
If it wasn't for 2 things, the long-term plans, that actually is a very strong commitment from a government and a parliament, and the fact that we all know that we cannot start planning for a change in our security policy environment today if something happens tomorrow. We just have to take the long-term perspective. So I wouldn't say it is difficult, but I would say that we have seen really over the past years the need to raise our readiness, our awareness, because there are so many changes going on at the same time, and they are also not only interconnected, but they have a tendency to kind of multiply each other. So when you have a strong threat from somewhere, you could easily see that on other aspects as well.
The domino effect of it, How does the defense contributions abroad contribute to Norwegian territorial security? And this is a recurrent question, actually, so that's why I'm asking it.
Well, first and foremost, I think it is extremely important that we contribute everything we can into the alliance, because that is our security guarantee. And that's also why I'm stressing that not only military contributions, but also our political cohesion is so essential if we are to hold the alliance strongly together and be a stronger alliance. And all of NATO's member countries rely on NATO for their defense. So what we do abroad is part of that security guarantee. And that is
solely positive? I mean, our contributions abroad, does it always reflect positively on Norwegian security, or are there any risks and drawbacks?
Well, there will always be risks and drawbacks. And I've said several times when we had discussions about our engagement in Syria, when we had discussions on our engagement also in Afghanistan and Iraq, that there will always be those who have I would say, a desktop approach to this, who are more theoretical and not practitioners, and who are not politicians and decision makers. Because when you are a decision maker, you just, to put it mildly, the worst thing you can do is not to make a decision. You don't have that option. Exactly. You don't have that luxury. Yeah. You have to make a decision, often with not complete information, but you have to make a decision on what is best for Norwegian interests. And take the fight against ISIS as one example. That is a direct investment in our own security. And I see the same with all the other engagements that we have, that they are extremely important in order not only to safeguard the alliance and to care about the security challenges for all allies, but I mean, we also have a very strong generation of officers who have very distinct combat experience, which is a very important part of our national defense as well.
And you have to kind of sustain that level.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. I think the last question is NATO's presence in Libya worsening or improving the situation in the country? To which extent is peace and stability in Libya linked with peace in the Sahel region?
Oh, there are more links than I can talk about in 35 seconds, yes. I think. Yeah, but
give it your best.
Well, I'll try. I'll try my best, and it is definitely an issue that I know that we will be dealing with a lot when we enter into the Security Council. It is one of the hottest topics on the Security Council's agenda, and that is also why when we contributed militarily, because the UN was very, very clear to say that the world has to do something. It was, of course, because we saw that the situation that was evolving was impossible to sustain. That is also why we have been very engaged in the situation in Libya ever since. And what we're seeing right now is, unfortunately, a development where Libya is becoming more of a proxy war scene than anything else.
Yeah. Would you have thought that when the decision was made to intervene in Libya initially?
Well, I don't think anyone could see in 2011 exactly what the world will look like in 2020.
I think Libya was a great example of how sometimes you don't have that information available. Yeah.
And it's also a very good example of the fact that sometimes you have to make quick decisions because a bigger threat is actually imminent at the theater. And that was what we saw in Libya. The world together saw this.
So the red light is blinking and time flies in good company, but we really have to end our discussion here. I couldn't have asked for better company to end the last session of this year's Army Summit. Thank you so much, Ine. And a huge thanks to our loyal audience who've been with us Monday, Tuesday, and all through Wednesday. Really appreciate that you've taken the time to send in questions. Now, back to General Lars, or just Lars, to wrap up this year's Army Summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Again today also two great speakers. General Hodges reminded us of the importance of allies, and also he stressed the importance of readiness. Our own Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that a strong land power is a cornerstone in our national and foreign policy. And she also stressed the importance of a rule-based international system. The 11th annual Army Summit is coming to an end. Army Summit 2020 had to change. Our tried and trusted format did not fit the reality of the pandemic. And rather than trying to hold on to the past, we wanted to look to the future. To quote one of our most beloved national poets, Nordahl Grieg, who also lived and worked in tumultuous times, surrounded by enemies, enter into your time. Enemies can take many shapes, and the first step in taking control of a new situation is to understand its context. Adjusting to the current operational environment this year's new format has still allowed us the opportunity to listen to and discuss important topics with distinguished speakers like General Jim Mattis and General Ben Hodges. I've also had the pleasure to discuss joint operations and even closer cooperation with my counterparts in the Navy and Air Force. This kind of open, joint discussion was a useful format that we will explore further. The word trust has been one of the most frequently used words throughout the 3 days of this event. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Trust builds cohesion. Cohesion wins wars. I firmly believe that trust is one of the strengths in our open and liberal democracies. We trust our neighbors, we trust our brothers and sisters in arms, our authorities, and our allies. I believe that through the open and frank discussion we have had at this year's Army Summit, we have provided valuable insight into some of the challenges our armed forces are facing right now and will be facing in the future. In addition to acknowledging the increasingly harsh reality, our discussion has shown support, both from our political leaders and from our allies, for the need to strengthen the Norwegian Army. Reviewing discussed trends, threats, and our goal of maintaining both assurance and deterrence. I feel safe that our priorities to invest in new main battle tanks, air defense systems, and long-range fires are more than sound. Our numbers must grow in order to have the adequate volume to manage the risks we are facing and to be able to sustain the fight over time. A firm political commitment is necessary. We are looking forward to it. A future strengthened Norwegian Army with increased readiness and combat power as a part of our joint team is critical to solving the defense mission and avoiding war. We are ready to grow, and we can grow fast. But even more important than hardware and numbers are our soldiers. Emphasis on our core values, the importance of continuously educating ourselves, that being soldiers and officers alike, as well as the need to empower our junior leaders, are for me among the key takeaways from this year's conversations. The most important part of any army has always been, still is, and will continue to be our soldiers. Our soldiers are the army. This is my first Army Summit as the Chief of the Norwegian Army, and I have been truly inspired by the topics discussed here this year. I'm already looking forward to next year's event. As you might know, General Mattis is already invited. Aisha might be back, and I can guarantee both interesting topics and knowledgeable and inspiring speakers. Thank you to the Army Summit team with Jonas, Brede, Andrea, Matthias, and Fredrik. I truly admire your commitment. The Army Summit would not have been possible without our excellent co-host, the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and its Secretary General, Kate Hansen-Bundt. Thank you, Kate. A big thanks also to all of you who have contributed to the success of this event, both in the studio, on screen from different parts of the world, and above all, to the audience out there who have followed our discussions over the past 3 days. The Norwegian Army has existed for almost 400 years, and we will continue with our core business, to solve all our missions and always to take care of our soldiers. Thank you very much.